Okay, and you should be able to see my PowerPoint now too. So I just want to begin by acknowledging the custodians of the land where I am presently, the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So John Emmerson had 3 careers, first as a physicist, then as a barrister specialising in intellectual property, and throughout as a meticulous collector of rare books. Emmerson bequeathed his collection to one of 3 Melbourne libraries which he felt would be able to preserve it and allow for access to it, and the State Library of Victoria was chosen by his executors as the appropriate place following his death in 2014. Emmerson collected predominantly 17th century printed works centred on the Civil War, though he ranged widely throughout the century and beyond it. He began collecting when he was at Oxford, first as a postgraduate student at Worcester College, and then as a fellow in physics at New College, where he met the physician and book collector Bent Yule Jensen. In his essay, The Early Education of a Book Collector, Emmerson describes Yule Jensen giving him a news book to read, which contained an account of the execution of Charles V. Emmerson writes, the book seemed to take me straight to the heart of the 17th century. I had never seen anything that gave such a vivid sense of the past. After some careful experimentation with possible principles of collecting, a methodology that Emmerson explains occurred naturally to a physicist, Emmerson settled on the theme of books published or republished in response to the great political events of the 17th century. As his collecting gathered momentum, Emmerson followed a number of principles which led to a collection of the highest quality, as well as achieving a sustained thematic focus. There are numerous volumes that are examples of rare and fine bindings, as well as some significant presentation copies and volumes from 2 notable 17th century libraries. But these volumes still sit within the collection for their historical as well as aesthetic significance. Emmerson favoured original bindings, and he seems not to have minded annotations, especially if they were contemporary. He was also reluctant to cull anything, so that, for example, when he was told of a superior copy of Margaret Cavendish's biography of her husband, he bought it, but he kept his existing copy and even added a 3rd. Indeed, through a focus on material relating to certain aspects of the Civil War, Emmerson has a number of sequences of books, especially those with complex bibliographical characteristics. Perhaps the best example being 7 copies of Icon Basilicae, along with a number of explications and attacks on that work, including 3 copies of Milton's Iconoclastes. The result of this is an unusually focused private collection, reflective of Emerson's personal taste, but also a rich resource for research into the period and its book history, as well as offering the chance to understand a sustained modern collecting process that at the same time references the collecting processes of the 17th century. Summing up such a substantial collection is difficult, but given Emerson's interests, it's possible to offer some clear outlines here before I then discuss the implications of the collection entering the space of a public library. On Emerson's death, the collection numbered some 4,700 volumes, and if one counts the individual items bound together, then around 5,600 individual works. The collection can be characterised through its content as in many ways a careful representation of the tumultuous events of the 17th century, especially the mid-17th century, but it can also be characterised through its material nature as a meticulously chosen representation of the printed object, from high-end folio down to single-sheet broadsheet. Individual copies help to tell the story of the 17th century, while multiple copies tell what we might call a bibliographical story centred on significant examples, whether Icon Basilicae or Philip Sidney's works or a representative selection of almanacs. In order to fill out the idea of a more comprehensive historical account, Emmerson was happy to acquire later editions of a work. A good example is his 3rd edition of Bacon's Silva Silvarum of 1631, and he also has the 8th edition of 1664. Because this is a personal collection that has been preserved almost in its entirety, there are numerous outliers which become apparent only after a careful perusal of the collection as a whole. Given the collection's concentration on the 17th century, there are some outliers that are really a long way out. A good example is a collection of comic novels by the mid-19th century writer Cuthbert Bede, the pen name of Edward Bradley, which depict the adventures of Verdant Green, including his time as a student at Oxford. The volumes are notable for the accompanying illustrations, also by Bradley, and one can only speculate that the appeal for Emmerson was the nostalgic view of Oxford, the illustrations, the comic narrative, or all of these factors. But these are rare examples of 19th century volumes within the collection. There are a quite substantial number of 18th century items, which might perhaps be seen not as outliers, but as supplements to the 17th century core of the collection. These include philosophical works like those by Bishop Berkeley and legal books, but also a range of literary works from Sterne's Tristram Shandy through to Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho. The range of Emerson's early modern works reflects his interest in what we might term a historicist perspective. So he collected a series of news books, which were the 17th century version of our newspapers and which flourished during the Civil War. In particular, Emmerson has a complete run of Mercurius Civicus, often seen as the first metropolitan newspaper from 1643 to 1646, the run of the royalist Mercurius Alicus from 1643 to 1645, and the pro-Commonwealth Mercurius Politicus, comprising 615 issues from 1650 to 1660. The collection has a considerable number of works which can be classified as being on the margin between history and polemic. And there are also a series of works which would once have been called ephemera, most notably an especially interesting and substantial collection of almanacs. The almanacs include those by the most influential astrologers of the 17th and 18th centuries, John Partridge, William Winstanley, William Andrews, and William Lilly. The almanacs fit Emerson's political theme because they're not just prognostications and monthly outlines of things like moon phases and eclipses, but many of them also contain historical summaries and commentaries on current political events. In many respects, Emerson's decision to collect almanacs is a bit like Samuel Pepys's decision to collect ballads. The almanacs provide insight into what we might call popular culture and its heterogeneous consumers, as do a number of examples of cheap print, often collected and then bound together to help preserve them. And like the ballads, the almanacs, as I've noted, provide an insight into a segment of popular political views. Emerson's collection also reflects what could be seen as the three traditional categories for desirable antiquarian books. These are individual works that have an especial value because they're rare or beautiful or historically significant, running sets of the editions of a particular work, and a number of copies of a specific edition of a work, usually the first edition, but sometimes later editions if they're bibliographically important. Emerson has many prize individual volumes, ranging from James I's presentation copy of his works to his son Prince Charles, through to an exquisitely embroidered copy of Icon Basilicae. As far as running sets are concerned, Emerson has, for example, a complete run of all 8 17th century editions of Robert Burton's much revised Anatomy of Melancholy, and all except one of the editions of Philip Sidney from 1593 through to 1674. And finally, Emerson has many examples of multiple copies of a single edition, from the 3 copies of Margaret Cavendish's Life of her husband William that I've already mentioned, through to 4 copies of the 1681 Dryden, Absalom and Achitophel. This last category is, I think, especially interesting because it points to the way that scholarly interests have merged with book collectors' desires in recent years. Once, with the exception of editors, many of whom were also book collectors, scholars and critics were interested in the content of early modern books, but not their physical features. Now, with the material turn in early modern studies, scholars, at least some of them, join book collectors in wanting to know the provenance of individual copies, tracing reading and ownership histories, and paying ever closer attention to bindings, annotations, perfecting, repurposing, and so on. From that perspective, Emerson's multiple copies of, for example, Icon Basilicae are an invaluable resource. That they are now an accessible resource is, of course, owing to the fact that the State Library has the entire collection, minus a few items. Not only does this mean that the Rare Book Department has many thousands of examples of individual early modern items, but also that we can explore the collection as a collection. Emerson himself was drawn to 17th century collectors. In particular, he sought out books that had been collected by the diarist John Evelyn and by the Scottish lawyer Daniel Fleming. And in the essay he wrote about both these collectors for the BSANZ Bulletin in 2003, Emerson underlines how fascinated he was by their methods of ordering their books. This is especially the case with Fleming, who had a complex system of ordering his books, represented by abbreviations he's written on the title pages and front board of his books. This is an ordering system that tries to correlate the physical dimensions of books and their shelf order, so the library can expand while books can be easily located. Emerson owned 27 books from Fleming's library, and while Emerson's cataloguing system is not the same as Fleming's, it too orders books in a way that takes size and time of acquisition into account, rather than using an alphabet system or a subject system like Dewey Decimal. Similarly, John Evelyn was obsessed by libraries, proposing a library plan for the nascent Royal Society and amassing a library himself of around 4,000 volumes as listed in his 1687 inventory. Once again, Emerson was able to deduce that Evelyn's library was essentially ordered by size. The Emmerson collection has over 100 books either written or owned by Evelyn. These two parallel 17th century bibliophiles underline how important it is that the Emmerson collection has been preserved as a collection, which amongst other things fortuitously or perhaps intentionally mimics some aspects of 17th century libraries. I don't have the space here to discuss in any detail the third parallel 17th century library, that of Samuel Pepys. Emerson himself doesn't appear to have had a particular interest in Pepys, but I'm drawn to a number of interesting comparisons that could be made between the two collections, from the meticulous placement within specifically designed bookshelves through to the range of material, which includes, in Pepys's case, a significant collection of ballads, which can be compared to Emerson's collection of almanacs. Where scholars interested in early modern book history have spent time reconstructing libraries, the Emerson collection offers us a library in its entirety. Ironically, given the experience of COVID-19, the members of this panel have in fact spent our time reimagining the collection from a distance that has at times seemed almost as great as the distance that separates us from a John Evelyn or a Dan Fleming. This might be seen as a major disadvantage, but as I hope you'll see from this panel, we've in fact tried to spin gold from the straw that COVID has handed to us. I'm just going to stop sharing and hand over.
Thank you, Paul. I take it people can hear me, can they? I'm just going to share my screen.
Yes, we can hear you.
You can, fantastic, thank you. And I'm hoping you can now see my slides and I can progress through them. Kia ora koutou katoa, I'm Sarah Ross. I'm coming in from Wellington in New Zealand, and I'm going to give just a very brief paper, 10 minutes or so, to provide one micro example of research that is made possible by the SLV's acquisition of John Emerson's books. So Paul has looked across the collection. My focus is on one book that illustrates what can happen when a unique copy of a relatively commonplace early modern publication becomes publicly available for the first time in decades. The volume in question is a 116-page quarto in which 4 divine poems by the 17th century devotional writer Francis Quarles are bound together. These publications are not in themselves rare. Many copies of them are extant worldwide, frequently bound together in combinations common to this one. But Emerson's volume contains a series of contemporaneous readers' markings that provide intimate and quite unique evidence of 17th century engagement with Quarles's poetry. These markings speak directly to current literary, critical and textualist interests in the material book, marginalia and the history of reading, as well as to historicist and formalist scholarship on acanonical literary writing, its practitioners, and its value in our understanding of a cultural history of early modern England capaciously understood. Francis Quarles, who died in 1644, was a significant supporter of the royalist faction in the early years of the English Civil Wars. This is likely to explain Emerson's interest in his work, given the Civil War focus that Paul has outlined, and Emerson's quite specific interest in Charles I. But Quarles was also an enormously prolific devotional writer, whose poems were as popular in the 17th century as they have been ridiculed in the 20th. He is best known for his Emblems of 1635, a 17th century bestseller that was continuously reprinted right through until the Victorian era. And he wrote numerous other works, including, in the 1620s, a series of poems that paraphrase and retell key biblical narratives. The quarto volume in the Emmerson collection contains 4 of these, bound together: Job Militant, with Meditations Divine and Moral, Sion's Elegies, Hadassah, or the History of Queen Esther, and A Feast for Worms. 20th century literary critics have dismissed these biblical narrative poems as pious light reading, or less polite versions of the same. One describes them as religio-literary flatulence. But in the 17th century, they were widely read by women and men across a whole range of literate social classes. In the current upswing of scholarship on the history of reading and acanonical literary forms, Quarles is beginning to have his moment. The prominence of his work in private book collections, including those of women, has been noted. Hannibal Hamlin has traced the depth of his poem's influence on psalmic poetry in the 17th century. Peter Auger rates him alongside Du Bartas as one of the most important writers of the early century. And in my own scholarship, I've argued that Quarles and Du Bartas are formative influences on women writers who are often very explicit in admiring and imitating him. I have in fact argued that the divine poems that we find in Emerson's volume provide for women writers a paraphrastic genre that is a rhetorically modest alternative to the more ambitious epic that is exemplified in, for example, Milton's Paradise Lost. One notable feature of Quarles's biblical narrative poems is that they all contain a preface, they all contain a version of the same preface, defining the poem's genre and instructing his readers as to how they should engage with them. Quarles describes his poems as paraphrases of sacred history, and he outlines a poetic method or manner consisting in the paraphrase, the adjournment of the story, and the interposition of meditations. These meditations evolve out of and interrupt the sacred history being retold, and each meditation is demarcated explicitly from the poem's main text by a decorative band, as you can see here. In these meditations, the biblical is related to Quarles's contemporaneous society in one or more of 3 ways that Quarles again outlines in his prefaces. The relationship is either ethical, relating to the manners of a private man, political, relating to public society, including the relationship between princes and subjects, or economical, in the sense of household management, including relationships between husbands and wives. This then is Quarles's outline of his poem's form, and he then instructs his readers on how to engage with this. He says in each of his prefaces, "I have gleaned some few meditations obvious to the history. Let me advise thee to keep the taste of the one whilst thou readest the other, and that will make thee relish both the better." In the history of how early moderns read their books then, Quarles is one particularly instructive authorial voice. Imagine then my delight to find in John Emerson's copy of Job Militant markings that are unique and that are uniquely revealing, showing a reader engaging with the text in exactly the way that Quarles tells them to. There are in several places marginal crosses of these kinds, or vertical lines and brackets. These are obviously markers of emphasis or pause. Notably, almost all of them are on the meditations. It is in the adjournment of the biblical story, but keeping the taste of that story in mind, that the reader takes the time to reflect on their own ethical or personal concerns. The reader notes, for example, that they read with great comfort the third meditation, an ethical meditation in Quarles's terms that berates Alexander the Great for his worldly ambition. There are only 2 occasions where the reader marks up the text that is not part of a meditation. Indeed, in one, the reader notes this, not the meditation. Both of the non-meditational passages that the reader has marked emphasize character and personal qualities. The most striking, I think, is this long speech delivered by Job, delineating his woes, and the vertical reader's mark there continues through 3 pages of this italicized speech. One other marking indicates that the reader is interested in what Quarles has to say about the character of woman. The shorthand WO appears next to the rationale for God's creation of Eve. It is indeed possible that the reader is themselves a woman. Women read Quarles with enthusiasm, and we shouldn't assume that an unidentified book annotator is by default a man. I do have to say, though, that the handwriting, with its vestiges of secretary letter forms, is less typical of women in the period than an italic script. Paul has described the way in which the Emmerson collection has become public at the same time as a material turn in early modern studies has drawn increased attention to readers' markings. Histories of reading are flourishing, including the histories of women's reading, and of early moderns reading popular literary genres that don't align with our modern literary critical hierarchies. Quarles's biblical narrative poems are in the scope of both of these reconsiderations. They were enormously popular with women and are of a genre that is frequently dismissed, but which was deeply influential and which is reflective of 17th century patterns of thought and reading. The enormous popularity of Quarles's texts mean that a multitude of copies are extant in rare book libraries all over the world. I've examined tens upon tens of them in the British and Bodleian libraries, the Fulcher Shakespeare Library, the Huntington, and the National Library of Scotland. None are marked in the intimately interactive way that Emerson's Job Militant is. This is a very special copy. And indeed, the commonness of Quarles's books may itself contribute to the lack of comparable evidence elsewhere. With clean copies proliferating, unclean ones are less likely to have survived or to have been put to the market, with readers' markings being regarded as damaged by centuries of scholars earlier than our own. Now, however, markings such as these ones are seen as evidence of what Julie Crawford describes of Lady Margaret Hobie's books as goal-orientated reading, devotional, meditational, and reflective reading for spiritual and personal improvement. Here in the Emmerson collection, then, is one quite unique insight into the reception of Quarles by an early modern reader. We've long understood how Quarles wanted his poems to be read. Here in Emerson's Job Militant is confirmation that at least one early modern read their Quarles in pretty much exactly the way that Quarles told them to. I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm Rosalind Smith, and I'm just going to, by way of introduction, begin by saying that all of these papers form part of an ARC-funded linkage project that's in its first year called Transforming the Early Modern Archive, the Emmerson Collection at SLV. It's led from the new Centre for Early Modern Studies at ANU. And the project has quite a big team, 4 early modernists, 1 digital designer, a rare book librarian, Anna Welch, a PhD student, Julia Rodwell, who's presenting today as well, and a research assistant, Julie Robarts. And 5 of us are presenting today as part of this panel. So that's what joins all of these papers together. I'm just going to share my screen with my presentation, which is on early modern women's marginalia in the Emmerson collection. Just hold on. I hope you can see that. Yep. And this is a bit of a relaxing show and tell about some preliminary findings we've found in marginalia as part of the project. So over the last decade, there's been a growing critical interest in what, how and why early modern subjects wrote in the margins, end papers and paste downs of their books. This exciting new corpus reveals not only evidence of reading practice, but of writing, illustration, ownership, and myriad other forms of book use that illuminate the role of the book within Renaissance cultures. They were at once prized objects of ownership and exchange, and sources of blank writing material, at once places where humanist knowledge was transmitted, digested, produced, and reproduced, and where the stuff of everyday life, such as spectacles and scissors, were forgotten and have left their traces. Marginalia allow us to follow familial genealogies and friendship relationships, as well as requests to be remembered in prayers and wills, the beginnings of love affairs, and the traces of an individual subject's daily prayers. Much of the recent critical material on marginalia, however, focuses on how men annotated their books. Influential studies of reading, such as Heidi Brayman's 2005 monograph, Reading Material in Early Modern England, argue that women were largely silent in the margins of their books. Revisions of this position have uncovered an expanding corpus of marginalia by women, but much of it focuses on annotations by exceptional figures such as queens and noblewomen, or on marks of ownership, her book. The 5,600 works in the Emmerson collection offer an exciting new archive in which to explore the question of who annotated their books, in what ways and for what purposes. Preliminary research reveals a surprising frequency of annotation by women and raises questions about how early modern women's marginalia might be discovered, attributed and understood, especially when approaching a large archive of previously unseen materials such as that contained within the Emmerson bequest. The marginalia that we have located so far falls into 4 categories: authorial corrections, ownership, writing practice, and illustration. We can see an example of authorial corrections in one of the collection's 3 copies of Margaret Cavendish's Life of William Cavendish, which Paul's also mentioned, where here she adjusts the surname Banham to Bainham. As James Fitzmaurice and Liza Blake have shown, such corrections formed part of her practice of creating bespoke presentation copies of her work, combining scribal and print cultures for personal and political gain. This highly idiosyncratic individual practice might be contrasted with the second category of early modern women's marginalia found in the collection, generic marks of ownership, where a writer signs their name and follows it with the phrase, her book. Of the 100 items consulted in our first field trip before COVID-19 shut us down, 9, a surprising 9, had women's signatures, 6 of which were early modern hands and 3 dated. Here, for example, we have Maria Skerritt, her book, inserted into the typography of the title page of a 1608 edition of Michael Drayton's poems. In the case of Eliza Brewster, she records her name and her book on the end paper of a 1593 edition of the Arcadia, alongside the names Edward Brewster and Hester Barkham. But Eliza's name appears a second time in the book, again on the title page, ensuring that the reader encounters this volume from the start as her book. Yet this economy of signature and possession by women does not end there, as in the bottom margin of the final page of the book, Grace S. also signs her name. There are 3 words also dropped into that margin: love, lay, leave. Although perhaps not the same hand, these words offer an intriguing summary of love's loss, especially for female subjects in the early modern period, encapsulating the narratives of seduction and abandonment that gave rise to female complaint. We also have Margaret Alexander's signature on the recto of the flyleaf of a 1640 edition of a translation of Ovid's Metamorphosis, accompanied by a gift inscription noting in Latin that the book was a gift of her husband, John Thisbe, in 1668. In a fourth example, Liz Pulteney signs the verso of the flyleaf of her Bible and exhorts the reader to remember the 22nd of May, 1738. On this flyleaf, we can also see some single letters, evidence of handwriting practice, another large category of marginal annotation in the early modern period, where paper was expensive and blank leaves invited children and adults alike to rehearse their letters. The Emmerson Collection provides a wonderful example of this in Anne Mansell's copy of Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadia, printed in 1628. We see on the paste down, Mansell has practiced writing her name, as well as a note to her mother. Dear mother, I received your letter and tokens, and for them I give you many thanks for them. And a short rhyme, Anne Mansell is my name, and with my queen am right the same. Anne Mansell's practice of the note to her mother occurs elsewhere in the volume, alongside multiple signatures, a partial alphabet, and lines copied from the text. We see here evidence of writing rather than reading, as well as of familial relationships, a glimpse into how a child might have communicated with her mother and her anxiety in getting that communication right. Similarly, in one of the most richly annotated volumes discovered so far, we can see multiple hands, including repeated practice of the word court, and this is upside down on the right-hand page, with a large, elaborate C. Next to this, in the same hand, right in the middle of the page, we can see the name Elizabeth. And on the facing page, a drawing of a dog's head, and then the same dog in full. Above it, in tiny letters, is the Lord's Prayer, printed in tiny concentric circles. This page alerts us to the way in which marginal annotations are textual and visual, in ways that have not yet been commented upon in studies of early modern women's marginalia. Recent scholarship has extended what we consider to be marginalia to include marks of book use, such as smudges, rips and tears, and even paw prints, material cut and pasted into books, and objects left in books. But this recent materially oriented scholarship has not commented on the extent to which visual economies coexist in these pages alongside scribal print and material traces of practice and book use. Yet the examples that we have found already within the Emmerson collection point to a rich visual world of illustration in the pages of early modern books, including manicules, doodles, and drawings. One of the most interesting elements in our search for marginalia so far is that we have found it through serendipity rather than where we expected to find it. Texts traditionally used by women, such as domestic treatises, to date contain no marginal traces. Yet Drayton's poems, Sidney's works, and Ovid's Metamorphosis all contain multiple women's marks of ownership and use. Heidi Brayman argues that in the Arcadia, quote, addressed both generically and explicitly to women, no known examples of substantial annotation can be attributed to female readers. Of her sample of 151 copies, 1590 to 1674, 105 bear contemporary marks, and women wrote their names in 28 of these. The marginalia in the Emmerson collection adds more examples of women's signature to this list, but it raises other questions as well. What might constitute, quote, substantial annotation? How do we read annotations that are minor, ephemeral, familial, and domestic? Can women's marginalia correspond to male-authored annotations, such as those Gabriel Harvey made in his Livy, famously described as a humanist program of reading for action by Lisa Jardine and Anthony Grafton? If not, how do we read and value the kinds of annotations women left in their books, which in this sample record intimate relationships, human and animal, religious practice, and material possession? These questions underwrite the larger project into which the analysis of the Emmerson collection falls, the first large-scale study of how, where and why early modern women wrote, drew and marked their books. The previously unseen material of the Emmerson collection is already starting to overturn some of the received views of early modern women's annotation, showing it to be more widespread, formally varied and visual than expected, and raising questions about how we might value and analyse marks in books. So thank you for listening. I'm going to stop my sharing now and pass over to Anna and Julia.
Hi everyone, it's lovely to be here. Thank you, Ros. My name's Julia Rodwell, and as Rosalind mentioned, I'm the PhD student associated with the Emmerson Collection Research Project. So this will be a joint paper between myself and Anna. Anna will speak first, but I'll just introduce it now. So a major outcome of the Emmerson Collection Project will be an online exhibition that brings the collection to life beyond the physical borders of the library. Coincidentally, as I'm sure you don't need me to tell you, at the beginning of 2020, cultural institutions across Australia, including State Library Victoria, closed their doors to the public for months as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. During this time, institutions relied more than ever on their digital channels and digitised collections to uphold their responsibility to service the community, to keep audiences engaged, and to maintain access to their programs, resources, and collections. Consequently, 2020 saw an influx of online exhibitions produced by galleries, museums, and libraries. So while the concept of an online exhibition has arguably been around since the early 1990s, the term is under-analysed. In addition, the practice of creating online exhibitions is under-theorised. As a result, within the GLAM sector and associated academic disciplines, there is some hostility towards the term online exhibitions because the definition is too broad and can be used for any online resource containing images and text. In this paper, we argue that online exhibitions can and should go beyond the image and text interface to enhance engagement, accessibility, and interpretation of cultural objects. Anna will present an overview of the history of exhibiting books, and I will then examine the definition of online exhibitions and present examples of existing types. I will conclude by proposing a new methodology for creating online exhibitions that reflects what is distinctive about the digital realm rather than mimicking the physical. Thank you, and over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Julia. So this is a history of the idea of book exhibitions, but a very rapid one, so as to leave most time for Julia's part of this paper. So, I've got my slide moving, sorry, there we go. The idea of visiting a physical exhibition is so familiar to us today that it's easy to forget that there was a time when this experience did not exist, just as, of course, there was a time when the form of the book did not exist. The form of the physical public exhibition as we know it today, that is, the experience of walking with others through a space wherein objects of material culture are displayed in showcases with accompanying text, is the child of the great international exhibitions of the 19th century. These international events had their origins in the national exhibitions of France, the first of which took place in 1798, a product of both revolutionary politics and Enlightenment philosophy, both of which sought to focus on the rational and secular achievements of human industry. The concept of an exhibition of this kind came apparently from Robespierre, though as it turned out, he was executed before the idea could be. Books were a part of that 1798 exhibition, which was held in temporary porticos erected around a central temple of industry in the Champ de Mars, and you see an illustration of that here. The printers Pierre and Firmin Didot won an honorable distinction, which was the highest award given, for their edition of the Roman poet Virgil, produced using the ink and type of their own manufacture, printed on large paper using the stereotype process named and popularized by their family, and with 23 engravings. Adopting this model of the exhibition, the Great Exhibition of Works of Industry of All Nations, held at Crystal Palace in London in 1851, and all of those that followed in its wake, including the 1880 edition in Melbourne, highlighted human achievements in art, science, and education, as well as more pragmatic industrial areas, and books were always a part of this. In presenting awards for books, for the crafts involved in the production of books, such as printing and binding, these exhibitions focused on what is still the major appeal of book displays today, materiality. However, I think it's significant that books were not included in the fine arts sections of these international exhibitions. Instead, they sat with education and the liberal arts, a recognition of their functional nature, objects made to be used, not simply looked at. In a longer paper, we would make some stops in the 16th and 17th centuries to explore the place of display of books in the forms of the Kunstcabinet or Wunderkammer. You see the first published image of a Wunderkammer there on screen. The paper museum, most famously that of Cassiano del Pozzo, and the scholarly library here imagined in this beautiful drawing of the Vision of St. Augustine. And you see the books on a display stand in the back, as well as on this shelf. I think we should all have bear claw lights in our studies. There's books everywhere in this image. So I would spend more time on those, but obviously due to time constraints, I'm just going to conclude by noting an example of book exhibition in a religious context from the 13th and 14th centuries, which I think offers a valuable comparison to the modern exhibition's focus on the affective pull of books as functional material objects. Just quickly for context, the advent of the mendicant orders in the early 13th century, that's the religious orders including the Franciscans and the Dominicans, who were founded in emulation of the itinerant preaching lifestyle of the apostles, represented a fundamental shift in Western Christian culture, one which focused on personal emotional identification with God and which historians refer to as affective spirituality. While monastic churches were situated outside towns and were closed to the general community, mendicant churches were urban and open to all. Were not in use during the Mass, missals like the Codex Sancti Paschalis, which was made in Perugia in central Italy around 1290 and is now owned by the Australian Franciscan Order and kept at SLV on permanent deposit, would have been displayed open on a book stand within the church. So that's the book the priest uses to perform the Mass. But in between Masses, it would have been on display. As a result, the book gives us clear physical evidence of people's interactions with it, revealed during recent conservation work. Marks from people rubbing and kissing the crucifixion miniature, and you can see sort of areas of wear and tear on the page there. Blobs of wax from candles held to illuminate its surface. Bits of hair, glass, and seeds, and even special guest star, an oriental rat flea, which was the plague-carrying kind. All of these things have been found in the gutters of this book. And the dirtiest of all its openings is the one that contains the crucifixion miniature. This is the opening at which it would have been displayed in the church as a sacred text inviting physical contact. Physical exhibitions of books in the mode of the international exhibitions place a barrier between people and book, but they retain the ability to celebrate the aura in Benjaminian terms of the object. The book is physically present in space with the viewer, and its material qualities are perceived, if not experienced haptically. The opportunity for digital exhibitions of books is to take full advantage of the paradoxical power of digital space. Its liminality can facilitate increased access to fragile digital materials, although still not haptic or olfactory experience. But that same quality of liminality must in some way be overcome in order to create rich and satisfying interactive and affective experiences of books as material culture. So I'll hand over now to Julia to bring us up to the present day.
Thank you, Anna. Just share my screen. Okay, so what then is the future of rare book exhibitions? So amongst the wealth of digital content produced by cultural institutions during lockdown, there were online exhibitions. Through our research work for the Emmerson Collection Project, I have identified 4 types of what can be described as online exhibitions. They are self-described online exhibitions, which are usually presented in an image and text format, virtual tours, virtual experiences, and data visualizations. So many current online exhibitions have not moved much past the image and text format of 90s sites, such as Web Museum, one of the earliest examples of an online exhibition. For instance, the Smithsonian Library's current online exhibition, titled Magnificent Obsessions, contains a landing page with links to 3 thematic sections, each containing static images and captions alongside a paragraph of analysis. There's only one way into these online exhibitions. The viewer can either scroll or click hyperlinks to other pages contained on the site. Magnificent Obsessions shares similarities with the Smithsonian's own 2002 online exhibition titled Wonderbound, the Rare Book in Historical Collections, which can be accessed via the Smithsonian's archive of online exhibitions. While Magnificent Obsessions contains some updated design elements, such as a recurring motif and a strong color palette, its image and text format remains the same as Wonderbound from 2002. These online exhibitions replicate the approach to display commonly seen in physical exhibitions, that is, a wall label alongside an artwork. As a result, they have been criticized by academics such as Christy Kokegi as uncritical adaptations of our analog practices to the online/digital realm. Another popular type of online exhibition is the virtual tour. These sites present a 360-degree simulation of an existing physical exhibition or gallery space, such as the Frick Collection's tour of its 2017 exhibition, Murillo, The Self-Portraits. While virtual tours can also be criticized as unimaginative reproductions of physical exhibitions in the digital realm, in contrast to the previous examples, they provide a sense of the materiality of the book. As can be seen in the Frick Collection example, the books on display are presented as a 3-dimensional cultural object. Virtual tours also rely on audience interaction. Users choose their own path through the exhibition. And perhaps the best examples of online exhibitions are from sites that do not describe themselves as such. For instance, the Garden of Earthly Delights is described by its creators as an interactive documentary and a rich online experience. Upon entering the site, viewers are met with a specially commissioned soundscape and have the option to either take an audio tour of Bosch's famous painting or navigate their own way through a series of signposts. The high-quality reproduction of the triptych also allows viewers to zoom in on a vast array of details. Using Joanna Drucker's term, these sites can be described as a type of performative digital materiality. Indeed, they emphasize the performative capabilities of the digital object to intensify the experience of viewing the work and to create an emotional response. One cannot help but think of analogies to the early Impressionist painters who emphasized every brushstroke to make it clear that their work was a painting and not an imitation of real life. Codex Atlanticus by the Visual Agency places a similar emphasis on audience interaction and engagement. The site presents a data visualization of the Codex Atlanticus, the largest collection of Da Vinci's drawing and text. Using a unique page motif, color coding, and timelines, the site allows visitors to explore the collection by topic, subject, date, and/or numerical order. Once refined by the viewer, the representation of the whole collection remains on screen, with the irrelevant pages shaded out. As such, viewers retain a sense of scale of the collection and how each part relates to the other. These types of data visualization sites share an interactive mapping element, usually in the form of a timeline, grid, and/or network web. Through mapping, they aim to capture the bigger picture, but often present little or no analysis of the works. Like virtual experiences, data visualizations reflect what is distinctive about online exhibitions, although in this instance, it's the ability to represent volume and scale, as well as layers of metadata. Digital is the perfect environment for exploring cultural object data, which is related to but distinct from physical objects. So these examples raise key questions regarding the role of online exhibitions. What makes them distinct from physical exhibitions, and how do we experience rare books and other cultural material in the digital age? A common criticism of online exhibitions is that they will never replicate the real thing. But what can online exhibitions do that physical exhibitions can't? Well, the obvious example is accessibility. As Web Museum still boasts, the Web Museum is open 24 hours a day throughout the year. Online exhibitions also have the potential to be a space for extended scholarship and learning. They can be updated with new knowledge or augmented with data, visualizations, or images from other institutions. From a practical perspective, online exhibitions are also typically free from the constraints of loan agreements and insurance costs, meaning that they can show works together that would otherwise not be seen together. As with the example of the Garden of Earthly Delights, online exhibitions can also encourage the viewer to take their time, to look closer, and to notice details they may otherwise miss in a physical museum setting. The annotations of marginalia Sarah and Ros described earlier are perfect examples of this. And as we saw with the Codex Atlanticus, online exhibitions can also take advantage of the possibilities of working with data and the unique ways in which it can be visualized. Data visualization has the potential to offer multiple ways into the exhibition and can enhance audiences' understanding of the connections and relationships between cultural material. Indeed, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, one of the most well-known art critics and theorists on curating today, describes his curatorial work as junction making between objects, between people, and between people and objects. The byproduct of this junction making being the exhibition. Using this simple description of exhibition making, we can begin to develop a methodology for online exhibitions that enhances these relationships. As has been argued, data is what separates the digital from the physical, and for this reason, it is the data that first needs to be analysed and modelled to make meaningful connections for display in an online exhibition. A widespread problem we have encountered during our research for the Emmerson Collection Project is that cataloguing records for rare books prioritise titles and authors, and often overlook the context in which the book was produced or the significance of its materiality. Indeed, records don't always capture embroidered bindings, and if they do, this information is often relegated to the free text notes section, creating what is known as data silos. That is, records that do not and cannot speak to one another to make connections explicit or to reveal new information. There is a way to make connections explicit using data ontologies to map, store, and display cultural object data. Unfortunately, I don't have time to explain this in detail. However, as you can see in this slide, using the classes and properties defined by the Cultural Heritage Ontology, the CDOC Conceptual Reference Model, we can make explicit connections between both books in the Emmerson collection and those in external collections. The Emmerson copies on this slide are on the left and in the middle, and the book on the right is from the Bodleian Library. In this case, the connection between these objects is the embroidery workshop that produced the bindings. As part of her research on the Emmerson collection, my co-presenter Anna will be exploring this connection further. These objects can also be connected by their use, in this case for prayer. Once again, this information would not necessarily be explicit in traditional data records. Once the data is modelled, it can be exported into what are known as data triples, which are then stored in a database. A user can then query the database based on the connections revealed in the ontology, rather than just via a keyword, resulting in more comprehensive search results. Knowing connections can be made explicit under the surface of an online exhibition inspires exciting possibilities for how they can also be visualized on its surface, its interface. This will be the next phase of my PhD research. So while the Emmerson project is still in its infancy and much work remains testing this methodology for online exhibitions, one thing this year has been made clear. COVID-19 has highlighted that the audience for online exhibitions is already here and waiting. So apart from the project team, thank you very much.